Chris Holtman's tenure as Ohio State's basketball coach is officially over. On Wednesday, Ohio State made the move to fire Chris Holtman. With a few weeks still to go in the regular season, the final straw coming on Tuesday night as Ohio State suffered a road loss at Wisconsin. Far from its worst loss of a season, but Ohio State's ninth loss in the last 11 games, and at a point where it certainly felt like the season was pretty much over for Ohio State, but Ohio State had no realistic chance of making the NCAA tournament. Uh, Ohio State decided it was time. I don't know that either of us, Andy, necessarily expected that it was going to come today, but I think we both felt that this was inevitable to happen sooner or later, that Ohio State was going to have to make a change of a men's basketball program, and that change has now officially happened as Chris Holtman is out as Ohio State's men's basketball coach.
Yeah, certainly not the timing I was expecting. I mean, I had a dentist appointment scheduled for this afternoon. I had to cancel and help break this news to you fine people out there. No, this was, I think the reason it kind of makes sense in my mind, I guess, is that Ohio State, just looking at the trajectory of this season, had kind of been, they'd been improving the last few games, you could say. Obviously, you blew the 18-point second half lead against Indiana. That wasn't an improvement, but at Iowa, you had come close at least, and that was a game that if you had a better record and weren't losing a ton of games already, you could have handled. They finally closed out a win late against Maryland in a double overtime game, and I think Chris was trying to point to the improvement of the team coming out of that, and yet you go and you lose this Wisconsin team that, yes, is top 20, but is off 4 consecutive losses. You only score 54 points in that game. And frankly, I didn't think Wisconsin played all that well. I thought it was a very winnable game. It felt like they were kind of throwing darts at a wall. Bowen Hardman playing a career high in minutes. Not that he played poorly. I actually thought he gave him some stuff out there. But, I think the more I've thought about it, the more the timing kind of makes sense, because the only path to the tournament from here is pretty much win out with a win over Purdue, which, who's expecting Ohio State to do that on Sunday, right? And probably win a couple games in the Big Ten tournament. So I think the path was such that maybe Ohio State wanted to get this process going as quickly as possible, and felt that with this loss, how the team looked, that, any improvement you could argue now really wasn't reflected in that Wisconsin game. And so again, you start the process now rather than later.
Yeah, and obviously these things are always a process. So most likely this decision was not made on Tuesday night. Like, it was probably already in the works for a couple weeks now. There's certainly, you could point to a couple of games. I think that loss at Northwestern, where they just looked lifeless. I think they were down by like 35 points at one point. That was certainly a game where I think that was the first time I said to you, like, hey, you should probably get your Chris Holtman fired story going, because
Yeah.
you never know. And then certainly that game last week against Indiana, blowing that 18-point lead, we both agreed at that point it felt like a new low for this Ohio State program. And we've been talking about it all year. I mean, the apathy around this program, just from our listeners out there, I think the interest in this program is lower than it's been in a long time, and that's a reality of the results that this team has had over the past 2 seasons, where 2 years in a row, we've seen pretty much an utter collapse in Big Ten play. Ohio State, again, I mean, to me, yeah, you said they were going to have to win out. They would have had to win the rest of their regular season games to get to that 20-win number that we had floated out there, which was what they probably needed to make the NCAA tournament. I don't think anybody thought they were going to win their next 6 games in a row. They were going to have to do that or win the Big Ten tournament. So, neither of those things are likely. I don't think changing from Chris Holtman to Jake Diebler at this point makes those things any less likely. I'm not sure it makes them any more likely, but I don't think it makes them any less likely, unless players start entering the transfer portal, which is certainly possible because Ohio State now has a transfer portal window. But the reality is, keeping Chris Holtman employed any longer was only delaying the inevitable at this point. He was not going to be back as Ohio State's basketball coach next year. It was clear that he was just not getting the job done. And that's just the cold hard truth. And his 7th year as Ohio State's basketball coach, it's a team that has yet to make the Sweet 16, has yet to seriously contend for a Big Ten title. And, all the things we talked about going into this year in terms of bringing in another top 10 recruiting class, bringing back a strong class of sophomores, bringing in some veteran transfers. It just hasn't all come together the way it was supposed to, at least not in a way that yields results. And I don't think there was anything you could point to and say, this is a reason why Chris Holtman should keep his job beyond this year, other than maybe the $12.8 million that Ohio State is going to have to pay him. But you had mentioned it before. I mean, the amount of money they're losing right now just on people not buying tickets for games is a part of that equation too. So with Ross Bjork coming in, I certainly felt like he was going to want to make a change. I think probably the notable part of this is that Gene Smith was willing to make that change. That, on his way out the door, he was willing to make that change, to pull the trigger when it needed to be. And so, credit to him for that, I think he realized that it was time to make that change. And Ohio State has confirmed that Ross Bjork is going to lead that search when he comes on board in March, which certainly makes sense because Ross Bjork is going to be this next coach's boss. And so there's no reason for Gene to be picking Chris's successor. Ross Bjork is certainly the one who's going to lead that search. And with that in mind, Andy, you just published a story this afternoon on some of the candidates who could make sense for Ohio State to replace Chris Holtman. Who are a few of those names in your mind that you think would really make a lot of sense?
The one I've been saying for a while now is Greg McDermott. I think, even back in January when you really started thinking about, okay, things are taking a downturn, this could be it. He was involved in the search last time. He's had a long track record of success at Creighton. I just think that hire would make a lot of sense for Ohio State for a lot of reasons. I think there's a couple that are intriguing to me from a perspective of their high risk, high reward, perhaps. One of the big ones in that regard for me is Lamont Paris. Paris isn't a guy who's been coaching all that long, a head coach all that long. But he's made a very quick turnaround at South Carolina. They're 21-3 this year. Advanced numbers seem to indicate maybe they're not as good as that record, but in any case, I mean, what he's done with South Carolina in a very short span of time, a guy who's got Ohio ties, a native of Findlay, Ohio, very interesting there. And then, I actually like Dusty May a lot at Florida Atlantic. I know that's not exactly, it's not a big name program, right? It's not a big name hire per se, but it's a one that a lot of people I think would be intrigued by. And you make a Final Four at a school like that. That's kind of a big deal, and it's eye catching. And I think maybe Ohio State basketball could use some juice, someone who has achieved big results, even if it's just, again, not with that long track record like a McDermott has, or even, Thad Matta is, a possibility to be brought back. I think I wouldn't lean toward that happening. I think you're best off moving in a new direction, but he's regained his health, which I think is kind of what compromised the tail end of his career at Ohio State. Obviously had great success before all of that unfolded, and now that he is feeling better, he's having, great success at Butler right now in terms of turning that program around, and they're not like at the top of the conference, but they're a really solid team, and they weren't when he got there. So I think that there's some attractive candidates there. Obviously, still a lot to evaluate, a lot of gossip. The one home run that Ohio State can try and hit that I think is rather outlandish, but certainly at least worth a phone call is Jay Wright. Talk about a guy who just in November said he has no interest in returning to coaching, but is an analyst for CBS Sports right now, so there's no ties to a school that's keeping him from coming to Ohio State. And won multiple national titles at Villanova, for those unaware. I'm sure many are who are listening to this. So if Ohio State can get that would be probably the number one candidate. But who's to say if he'd even, be interested beyond picking up that initial phone call, right? But certainly worth at least gauging his interest. So, you know, we talked about this earlier, Dan. The difference between this coaching search and say if Ohio State was searching for its next head football coach is that you're really just throwing darts at a board at this point in some respects, because there's so many ways you could go with this. Basketball, you know, there's a lot more coaches involved in these searches. It's not as like Ohio State's not quite a blue blood in basketball, although they do have some program prestige. So whereas the list of possible head coaching football candidates, if Ohio State had to make that move, would be much smaller. The basketball list is much bigger, but still, I think those people that I mentioned are among a group that's a good starting point for Ohio State.
Yeah, I mean, the question is Ohio State going to go and pry a coach away from another big name program, or are they going to go for someone who's maybe more of an up and comer, somebody who's looking for that bigger job? And I think, either way could work if it's the right guy. You mentioned Dusty May. That was when we first started thinking about possible replacements for Chris Holtman. He was the first name that jumped to mind for me because of how good he's been at FAU. And just the fact that, that's a guy who I think would certainly have reason to be interested to make that jump. I think, there's a lot of other names that get thrown around. We mentioned names like Nate Oates at Alabama or Eric Musselman at Arkansas. I think those are a couple of guys that would be intriguing to go after. Would they actually be interested? I don't know. I mean, money talks. So if you offer them enough money, you might be able to get those guys. But it's hard to say. I know, another name that's been thrown around is Sean Miller, which would be an interesting one. Certainly has a lot of ties to the state. Also has a bit of a checkered past with what went down at Arizona. And so I think this search will tell us something about Ross Bjork as well, because it will tell us how willing is he to take a risk on a candidate who maybe has some more risk factors. And on top of that, it will also tell us how much does Ross Bjork value men's basketball at Ohio State. Is Ohio State going to go and pay a big salary and really try to make a big power move here? Or, are they going to go for somebody who's maybe coming from a smaller program and therefore might come a little cheaper? I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. And we will start to get a little more information about that tonight when Gene Smith is scheduled to meet with the media this evening. So we'll certainly have more coverage, a lot more coverage of this to come on 11 Warriors. As Andy, we've talked about it. The basketball season felt kind of uninteresting, but now it feels interesting again, because now Ohio State has a new coach to search for. And, we'll also see, how does, do either of us think that Ohio State is going to promote internally? It's unlikely, but it will be interesting to see how Jake Diebler does in this interim role as well, because I certainly think he's someone who has the potential to be a future head coach somewhere. And so it'll be interesting to see how he handles this interim run, whether he can spark anything from this team. Probably not going to be enough to make a magic run into the NCAA tournament, but if he can provide some kind of spark for this team in its last few weeks of the season.
Absolutely. I think at the very least he could be a mid-major head coach somewhere. It would take something miraculous from him to really emerge as a candidate for the full-time Ohio State head coaching job, I think. I mean, they'd have to do something incredible here down the stretch. And Jake's a great guy. And again, like we've said, I think would be a very capable head coach at a mid-major. But right now, doesn't have a background of experience, really doesn't have the qualities you're looking for, the resume you're looking for in an Ohio State head basketball coach. So, it'll be a fun thing to watch just in terms of, hey, his program is now in transition. It's in flux. How do they respond? What do the players do? How do they perform under an interim head coach right now? And yeah, I think this added a lot of interest to the back end of Ohio State season where there wasn't before. And, I think for a program where apathy has kind of ruled the day for the past few months, and that's really, as we discussed earlier, really has been reflected in the attendance numbers, there's now a reason at least for people to be interested, for people to maybe watch the team, for people to at least follow what's going to go on with the head coaching search. So we'll be here to cover it all.
Jake Diebler's first game as interim head coach will come against number 2 Purdue on Sunday. So not an easy first game for Jake Diebler, but we'll see how that goes. Andy will certainly be there at Schottenstein Center for that one. And as we said, lots more coverage to come on 11warriors.com. So stay tuned with us there and here on 11 Warriors YouTube channel. And thanks for watching press coverage.